Welcome back to the channel where we dissect the absolute unmitigated gall of history's most baffling individuals. I'm your host, Steph, and today we are talking about a guy whose very existence proves that the universe has a sick, twisted sense of humor. Ladies, gentlemen, and my non-binary friends, we've talked about people who've succeeded through genius. We've talked about those who have succeeded through ruthless cunning and those who have succeeded through raw, undeniable charisma. But today we are talking about a man who succeeded through weaponized stupidity. A man who failed upward with such astronomical momentum that he literally bent the fabric of reality to accommodate his dumbassery. I'm talking about an 18th century merchant who was universally recognized by everyone in his town as a complete and utter moron. A man whose enemies constantly gave him joke business advice, hoping he would bankrupt himself, only for him to accidentally revolutionize international trade and become one of the wealthiest men in America. A man who was so thoroughly unhinged that he faked his own death just to see who would cry, and then got mad when the results weren't to his liking. Buckle up, besties. Pour yourself a strong drink. Grab your emotional support water bottle, because the story of Timothy Dexter is going to make you want to scream into a pillow about the injustice of the universe. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1700s in Massachusetts. The American Revolution is just wrapped up. George Washington is doing his thing. Alexander Hamilton is drafting financial systems. And in the quaint, aristocratic town of Newburyport, the old money elites are sipping tea and smelling their own farts. Enter Timothy Dexter. Dexter was born in Malden, Massachusetts in 1747 to a family of laborers. He had virtually no formal education. His reading and writing skills were, to put it mildly, an absolute fucking catastrophe. He dropped out of school at age 8 to work as a farmhand and eventually apprenticed as a leather dresser. For those of you who don't know colonial trades, leather dressing basically meant scraping the fat and the hair off dead animal skins and treating them with a chemical soup that usually included animal brains and urine. It was a smelly, nasty, low-class job. But Timothy Dexter had a dream. He didn't just want to scrape piss-soaked cowhides. He wanted to be a gentleman. He wanted to be part of the Newburyport elite. He wanted the fancy clothes, the big houses, and the respect of the snobs who ran the town. So, what does any enterprising young man with zero marketable skills and a head full of rocks do? He marries a rich widow. In 1770, Dexter married Elizabeth Frothingham, a widow who was 10 years older than him and, more importantly, absolutely loaded. With her money, Dexter set up a leather dressing shop and started making a decent living. But a decent living wasn't enough. Dexter started attending local town meetings, trying to rub elbows with the bigwigs. He was loud. He was obnoxious. He was incredibly uneducated. The local bigwigs, the Harvard-educated lawyers and the wealthy shipping magnates, looked at this loud-mouthed leather scrubber the way you look at a cockroach that just crawled out of your salad. They hated him. They wanted him gone. But the universe? The universe was just getting started with Timothy Dexter. During the Revolutionary War, the newly formed American government issued a fiat paper currency called the Continental Dollar to fund the war effort. Because they printed too much of it and it wasn't backed by physical gold or silver, it rapidly depreciated. By the end of the war, the currency was virtually worthless. People literally used it as wallpaper, hence the phrase, "not worth a continental." So the war ends. The soldiers who were paid in this garbage currency are furious. They're practically giving it away. It's useless paper. Enter our boy Timmy. Dexter looks at this completely worthless currency, scratches his head, and says, "You know what? I'm gonna buy all of it." Why did he do this? Was he a financial visionary? Did he have some inside information? Fuck no. He was just a dumbass who saw that the paper had numbers on it and was selling for pennies on the dollar. Using his wife's money and his own savings, he bought literal boatloads of continental currency. The Newburyport elite laughed their asses off. They were practically popping champagne. Look at this idiot! He just blew his entire fortune on literal garbage. He'll be back in the leather pits by Tuesday. And then a little guy named Alexander fucking Hamilton dropped his financial plan on Congress. In 1790, to establish the credit of the new United States, Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume all the states' debts and redeem the continental currency at a fraction of its face value, but crucially, way higher than the absolute zero it was currently trading at. Specifically, bonds were issued that made those worthless scraps of paper suddenly very, very valuable. Overnight, Timothy Dexter didn't just become rich. He became fuck you rich. He became buy a mansion and terrorize the neighborhood rich. He bought a massive, sprawling estate in Newburyport. But because he was Timothy Dexter, he couldn't just have a nice garden. He hired an artist to carve 40 life-size, brightly painted wooden statues of famous people and slap them all over his lawn. He had George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Napoleon Bonaparte, and naturally a statue of himself. The inscription on his own statue, "I am the first in the East, I am the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world." The sheer, unadulterated audacity. The balls on this guy. The elites of Newburyport were absolutely seething. They were vibrating with rage. This illiterate buffoon was now the richest guy in town. So now, Dexter is swimming in cash, and he decides he wants to be a global merchant. He starts buying ships, but he has absolutely no idea how international trade works. He doesn't know what supply and demand is. He doesn't understand geography. The wealthy merchants of Newburyport see an opportunity. They realize that Dexter is so desperate for their approval and their business advice that he will listen to literally anything they say. So they decide to gaslight him into bankruptcy. One day, a group of merchants approached Dexter. "Timmy, old boy," they said, suppressing their shit-eating grins, "we've got a hot tip for you. The West Indies, the Caribbean. It's a massive emerging market. You know what they desperately need down there? Warming pans." Now, for my modern people who have central heating, let me explain what a warming pan is. In colonial New England, winters were a frozen hellscape. Before you went to bed, you would fill a brass pan with red-hot coals from the fireplace and rub it between your bed sheets so you didn't freeze to death in your sleep. The merchants told Dexter to send over 40,000 warming pans to the West Indies. The West Indies. The tropical, humid, equatorial, sweating your balls off at midnight Caribbean. Sending bed warmers to the Caribbean is like sending sand to the desert or a comb to Lex Luthor. It's the stupidest fucking idea in the history of commerce. Dexter, the sweet summer child, goes, "Wow, thanks for the tip, besties." He buys up 42,000 warming pans, practically emptying New England of its stock. He loads them into his ships and sends them south. The merchants of Newburyport are practically throwing a parade. They are certain that Dexter is ruined. There is no way he can recover from this. The ship arrives in the West Indies. The captain looks at the manifest. He looks at the blazing tropical sun. He looks at his cargo of 42,000 brass bed heaters. He is experiencing profound existential dread. He docks the ship, convinced he's going to be the laughingstock of the port. But then, a miracle happens. You see, The West Indies was the center of the global sugar and molasses trade. A local plantation owner happened to be walking by the docks. He sees these brass pans with long wooden handles. He stops. He stares. He realizes something incredible. The lids of the warming pans are on hinges. If you tear the lids off, what are you left with? You're left with a giant heavy-duty brass ladle with a long, heat-resistant wooden handle. It was the absolute perfect tool for scooping boiling hot molasses out of the massive sugar vats. The plantation owners lost their goddamn minds. They bought every single one of them. Dexter's captain sold all 42,000 warming pans at a staggering premium, marketing them as custom-built industrial molasses ladles. When the ship returned to Massachusetts, it wasn't empty. It was overflowing with prime Caribbean molasses and silver. Dexter made a fortune. The merchants were paralyzed. They could not compute what had just happened. The audacity of this absolute brain-dead yokel to take their sabotage and spin it into pure gold. It defied the laws of physics. It defied their God. Now, if this happened once, you'd call it a fluke. But Timothy Dexter's entire life was a glitch in the matrix. The merchants, now foaming at the mouth with hatred, tried again. They were determined to bankrupt this man if it was the last thing they did. They approached Dexter with another hot tip. "Hey, Tim," they said, "we've got another one for you. Send coal to Newcastle. Trust us. It's an untapped market. You're gonna make a killing." Now, you have to understand the phrase carrying coal to Newcastle. It was a famous 18th century idiom that literally meant doing something entirely pointless. Newcastle upon Tyne was the coal mining capital of the world. It was where all the coal in England came from. Telling someone to send coal to Newcastle is like telling someone to import ice to Antarctica, or telling Leonardo DiCaprio to date a 30-year-old. It just doesn't make any fucking sense. Dexter, opening on purely smooth-brained vibes, says, "Say no more, my guys." He charters a fleet of ships. He buys up thousands of tons of soft Virginia coal. He fills the holds to the brim, waves goodbye from the docks of Massachusetts, and sends his fleet across the Atlantic Ocean directly to the undisputed global headquarters of coal. The merchants of Newburyport finally breathe a sigh of relief. "We got him," they think. He literally shipped coal to Newcastle. The shipping cost alone will destroy him. The coal will rot on the docks. He is finished. The fleet takes weeks to cross the ocean. During that time, something unprecedented happened in England. The coal miners in Newcastle go on strike. It was a massive labor dispute. The mines shut down completely. For the first time in its history, Newcastle upon Tyne, the city built on coal, the city that exported coal to the entire British Empire, had absolutely zero coal. The city was freezing. The factories were grinding to a halt. Panic was setting in. And right at that exact, statistically impossible, cosmically absurd moment, Timothy Dexter's fleet sails into the harbor, loaded to the gills with premium American coal. The townspeople practically wept. They swarmed the docks. Dexter's captains, realizing they had a monopoly in a city desperate for fuel, jacked up the prices. They sold the coal at an exorbitant premium. When the fleet returned to America, the holds were bursting with British pounds sterling. Dexter had taken the biggest idiom for stupidity in the English language and turned it into the most lucrative trade deal of the decade. The Newburyport elites? They just stopped talking to him. They gave up. You cannot fight a man who is actively being protected by the god of fools. One thing I need you to understand is that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was his entire business model. He was playing a completely different game than the rest of humanity. Someone told him to export wool mittens to the West Indies. Mittens! To the tropics! He did it. And who bought them? A fleet of Baltic merchants whose ships had stopped in the Caribbean to resupply before heading up to the freezing coasts of Siberia. Sold at a massive profit. Someone else jokingly told him to send stray cats to the Caribbean. Dexter paid local kids a few pennies to capture thousands of stray cats off the streets of Boston. He shoved them all into a cargo ship and sent them to the islands. When the ship arrived, it turned out the local warehouses were suffering from a catastrophic rat infestation that was eating all their sugar. The warehouse owners bought every single cat at an insane markup. At one point, he accidentally hoarded massive amounts of whalebone, thinking it was something else. Almost immediately after, the French Revolution happened, fashion changed, and massive corsets requiring huge amounts of whalebone became the hottest trend in Europe. He held a monopoly on whalebone and made a killing. He shipped thousands of Bibles to the East Indies. A missionary group had just arrived and realized they forgot their Bibles. They bought Dexter's entire stock. He was unstoppable. He was a force of nature. He was the Forrest Gump of mercantilism. But as his wealth grew, so did his ego. And you know what happens when a mediocre man gets entirely too much money and unchecked power. He gets absolutely batshit delusional. Timothy Dexter wasn't just a terrible businessman who got lucky. He was also an incredibly toxic, narcissistic husband. Remember his wife, Elizabeth, the woman whose money he used to start his entire empire? Yeah, Dexter grew to despise her. Why? Because she didn't treat him like the living god he believed himself to be. She was constantly embarrassed by his antics, his public drunkenness, and his complete lack of social grace. Dexter's response to his wife's totally valid irritation was to start telling visitors to his mansion that his wife was dead. When people would come to the house and Elizabeth would walk into the room, Dexter would point at her and say, "Behold, the ghost of my wife. Pity she passed away so young. She's standing right there, alive, probably internally debating the merits of putting arsenic in his soup, and this absolute lunatic is gaslighting his guests into believing they are seeing a fucking apparition." But Dexter's obsession with death and his own legacy didn't stop there. He started wondering, if I actually died, who would care? How many people would cry? Would I get the massive state-sponsored send-off that a genius of my caliber deserves? So, in the ultimate act of narcissistic attention-seeking, Timothy Dexter decided to fake his own death. He had a massive, luxurious mahogany coffin built, complete with silver handles and a glass window so people could look at his face. He bribed his family, his wife and his children, into going along with the ruse. He built an extravagant tomb on his property. Word spread that the eccentric millionaire had finally kicked the bucket. And guess what? People showed up. Thousands of people. Over 3,000 people arrived at his estate. Some were there to mourn. Most were there to gawk. The local elites came just to make absolutely sure the bastard was actually dead. The booze was flowing, the food was extravagant, and the priest was giving a tear-jerking eulogy. Where was Dexter during all this? He was hiding in the kitchen pantry, watching the entire event through a crack in the door. He was having the time of his life, observing his own wake. But as he watched, he noticed something that pissed him off. His wife, Elizabeth, wasn't crying. She was sitting in the front row, dry-eyed, probably just enjoying the catering and mentally calculating how quickly she could liquidate his hideous wooden statues. Dexter was furious. The audacity of this woman not to be weeping uncontrollably over the fake death of a man who publicly calls her a ghost. Unable to contain his rage, Dexter burst out of the kitchen pantry in the middle of his own wake. The crowd went completely feral. Women fainted, men screamed. They thought the devil himself had brought this man back from hell. But Dexter didn't care about the guests. He marched straight up to his wife in front of the entire town and started viciously beating her with his cane, screaming at her for not shedding enough tears at his funeral. Yeah, let's just pause right here. It's funny to laugh at him shipping coal to Newcastle, but the man was also an abusive piece of shit. This is 18th century toxic masculinity at its finest. He quite literally wanted to beat his wife into performing grief for a fake tragedy he invented to feed his own ego. It's disgusting. And to make matters worse, the crowd, once they realized he wasn't a zombie, just kind of let it happen before the party eventually resumed, with Dexter acting like nothing weird had just occurred. The audacity of him. Seriously, the absolute nerve. Toward the end of his life, Dexter decided that since he was an undisputed titan of industry, he must also be a titan of literature. He decided to write his memoirs. In 1802, he published a book called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. People, this book is a masterpiece of unhinged crackhead energy. First of all, Dexter spelled the words phonetically based on his thick regional accent. Philosopher became philosopher. Guess became geese. But the real kicker? There was absolutely zero punctuation. None. Not a single period, comma, or exclamation point in the entire 30-page manifesto. Also, he capitalized letters completely at random. It was a single, breathless, schizophrenic run-on sentence complaining about politicians, the clergy, and his wife. He handed out copies of the book for free along the roads of Massachusetts. And incredibly, people loved it. They read it as a comedy. It was so bad it was good. They demanded a second edition. When it came time to print the second edition, Dexter heard complaints from the literary snobs that his book had no punctuation and was hard to read. So, what did our petty king do? At the end of the second edition, he added a single page. On that page, he printed 13 lines consisting entirely of periods, commas, colons, question marks, and exclamation points. Below this block of punctuation, he wrote a note to the readers. Here is a page of punctuation. You may pepper and salt it as you please. You have to respect the pettiness. It is a level of fuck you that transcends space and time. Timothy Dexter died, for real this time, in 1806 at the age of 59. He left behind an estate worth roughly $35,000, which in today's money is in the tens of millions. He left portions of his wealth to his family, but also left a significant amount to the town of Newburyport, stipulating that the money should be used to support the poor, provided the town officially hung a bell in his honor and recognized him as the great man he always knew he was. The town took the money. They never hung the bell. His house became a hotel for a while. A massive storm eventually blew away his ridiculous wooden statues. And slowly, the physical legacy of Timothy Dexter faded away. But his story? His story is eternal. Timothy Dexter is the patron saint of failing upwards. He is the ultimate proof that you don't need to be smart, you don't need to be educated, and you don't need to understand what the fuck you were doing to succeed in a capitalist society. You just need an unbelievable amount of blind confidence, the willingness to ignore the haters, and a universe that apparently loves a good joke. Next time you suffer from imposter syndrome at work, next time you think you aren't qualified enough, just remember Timothy Dexter. Remember the man who shipped bed warmers to the tropics and accidentally conquered the molasses industry. Channel that energy. But, maybe skip the part where you beat your wife for not crying at your fake funeral. Thanks for visiting the channel. If you enjoyed this descent into historical madness, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. What is the absolute dumbest financial decision you've ever made that somehow worked out? Stay audacious, friends. I'll see you in the next one.